Hi, everybody. This is another episode of the Acoustic Guitar Show with great guitar players, with great fingerstyle guitar players. And today we have another very, very special guest for the kind of thing we do. And this he's introduced by this. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Duck Baker.
Grazie, Daniele, and hello, everyone.
Hi, Duck. How are you?
Si tira avanti. I'm all right, thanks.
You're all right. That's the most important thing. As I briefly told you, these are meetings with great guitar players that both had and still have a very important role in developing our instrument and in telling people what happened while they were doing that. And my starting question is, how is it to grow like Duck Baker in a world that doesn't know Duck Baker yet?
Yeah. At which point do you mean to grow like Duck Baker? Do you mean when I was young?
When you were young, of course, and as you developed as a player, but you were a very unique player. But you were one of those who made that unique. So you had probably someone that inspired you, but you were an inspiration to many after you. So how was that?
Well, I mean, when I was young, I lived in Richmond, Virginia, but this was the 1960s. It was the time of the folk scene in America. Before I tried to play fingerstyle, I played with other young boys, ragazzini, in rock and roll bands and blues bands. But I was fascinated with playing with my fingers. But you know, as I say, this was like coffee houses, listening to folk musicians. So for me, for instance, one of the first people that I really tuned in on as far as a finger picker was Dave Van Ronk, and then all the old blues guys, you know, listen to Blind Blake and Bill Brunsey. But it wasn't that I was trying to necessarily really learn exactly what those guys did, the way that people like Stefan, taught and studied exactly what they did. I was interested in playing and in trying to develop my own ideas and listening as well to records a lot. Doc Watson. In Richmond, Virginia, there were some good local guitarists, but the person who influenced me the most was really a ragtime piano player whose name was Buck Evans. So he was playing rags on the piano, and this was a few years before the real ragtime revival, and people like Joshua Rifkin. So I was lucky to have someone around who was playing Scott Joplin and showing me things about ragtime and early jazz, say in 1965. And so that's one reason that I guess I sound a little bit different from other guitarists. I've always listened to other instruments as much as I have other guitarists.
Of course. I've been listening to your playing for a long time now, and probably jazz and blues have been your main influences. But I know you have been influenced by a lot of different things, like African music. I heard you playing Dollar Brand and other things.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, as well as very early on being interested in blues and ragtime, and of course there were some kids in the coffee houses in Richmond, Virginia, that played jug band music, that played bluegrass, that played traditional old time music, and I was interested in all those things. I sort of felt like if I wanted to get anywhere, I had to sort of focus on trying to learn a little bit of all of these things, because I knew that, for instance, I didn't come from a family like Doc Watson, where there was this strong, folk tradition being passed
Yeah.
down. And I felt like this was my idea at the time anyway, in order to compensate for that, I had to try to reach into as many things as I could. And I got very interested in jazz, modern jazz, just as a listener. I didn't understand how to play it. And so the first kinds of jazz that I started trying to play were like very early, things like what they would call classic jazz, New Orleans jazz, and playing those tunes like I was playing ragtime, and trying to improvise at the same time, a little bit anyway. And then also free jazz, because when I heard, I liked to listen to these guys, like Archie Shepp and John Coltrane. I had no idea what they were doing, but when I heard Sonny Sharrock, the guitar player, well, it wasn't that hard to sort of try to play the guitar that way, because it was just...
Who was he again?
Sonny Sharrock.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And I actually saw him playing with Herbie Mann. People don't remember he actually played with Herbie Mann, which was very strange. And I saw him in a jazz festival in the 60s. So I was starting at the extreme ends of the jazz tradition, with the very early and then the very, very modern. It took a very long time to make those two things meet in the middle.
And this all started with steel string guitar?
Well, you're right. I was playing steel string guitar at first, and like all the other young folkies, I thought, oh, well, nylon strings, that's for girls that want to play like Joan Baez. That's the way young guys thought in those days.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine pointed out and said, well, you're being silly, because listen to this. And he played some flamenco guitars. And I thought, well, that has as much guts as anything. And again, because I was listening to so many things, I was also attracted to the Indian veena, the nylon strung instrument. And I had the idea, well, I really liked the deep sound of the nylon strings or gut strings on the veena and on the flamenco guitar. And I had the idea, if I could get that kind of facility and play jazz with that kind of sound, it would be wonderful. Whether I actually did anything like that ever, I don't know, but that was my idea. And so, for instance, like by the time I started working with Kicking Mule Records, my technique was basically a steel string technique, but I was using a nylon string guitar. I had moved to San Francisco by then. I was playing swing, and the nylon strings worked very well for that. When you're strumming the way I was strum with my fingers. I did also try to play, I played a little bit of bluegrass and played with a pick, but I didn't develop. I could solo much better with my fingers, using a sort of rest stroke, and my kind of faux flamenco technique, which is very wrong technique, but it was a good way to play solos and a very good way to strum and back up. It's interesting looking back on this, because of course when I hooked up with Kicking Mule, I did that when I was in the San Francisco area, and I hooked up with Stefan's partner, Ed Denson. But Stefan, for somebody who, as we know, has very strong ideas about, the way things should be. But for instance, where some people thought, oh, this nylon strings, this isn't right, Stefan never had a problem with that. And Stefan, was a person who was very important in my development, because, I mean, there I was with Kicking Mule, and apart from Stefan, I was the only person who was really under contract and making a new record every year. And not only that, he was having me anytime I came up with new arrangements, pretty much. He would take me in the studio, and then he'd figure out later how to use them. I got very spoiled by that.
And we tend to, of course, to give the the role of beginners to the old bluesmen, right? Because they were the first to be recorded, and they were probably the first to use the acoustic guitar steel string as a solo instrument, even if it was just to back their vocals most of the time, right?
Well, yeah. Most of the time. I mean, certainly if you're talking about really developing a lot of fantastic guitar virtuosos playing in fingerstyle or something to do with that. I mean, you had a few people like Sam McGee who did great stuff, Frank Hutchison. But, I mean, you didn't have people that were as advanced, really advanced players like Blind Blake or somebody until you get a generation down the road. You get Merle Travis and people like that.
Yeah.
It's worth noting, by the way, that this thing about backing yourself while you sing in folk music in America, that comes from black musicians. British musicians didn't do that. You either sang or you played an instrument. You didn't do both at once. So this very simple thing is another thing that comes from African American tradition.
Yeah, and you had a very, very important role, and you studied a lot. You heard a lot. You listened to a lot of things. What was your idea of the steel string guitar when you started, and how, in your thoughts, how did it develop to modern acoustic guitar as we know it? What was the transition? Who were the players? What happened?
Now, I mean, this is a very complicated question because, of course,
this is why you're here.
Well, it's not just me, though. In other words, there were so many. To expand from my own experience, I started going around. I was meeting, for instance, when I remember, for instance, I was in San Francisco. Dale Miller, who was another person with Kicking Mule. So this would have been, say, 1974, maybe. He said, come over to the store. He worked in a music store. He said, we got some good ragtime players here today. And there was a couple of local guys there. Eric Schoenberg came in. And that's when I met Eric. So any place, and then around that time, as I started to get on the road and I would go places, I would meet other acoustic guitar players. But when I got to Boston, for instance, Eric introduced me to Guy Van Duzer, and Guy, of course, was coming very much out of Chet Atkins. Guy, like me, was a person who was very conversant with swing jazz and used swing chording and things, which was a new idea. But see, on the acoustic music scene at that point, there was lots of people that were getting interested in playing swing and Western swing. And when I was in San Francisco, people who were doing this, that were young guys my age, would be hired to play in the bands of some of the older musicians who played like traditional jazz and swing jazz and stuff, just playing small groups and playing around in little clubs around the Bay Area, because San Francisco was a sort of center for that. So, in other words, you might get somebody who had looked at blues, who had also taken lessons from, I'm not going to think of it, George Barnes, or somebody like this, who was a jazz guitar player and swing guitar player, but also crossed over into blues. So there was all kinds of things going back and forth. I started by saying that my main starting point was the folk world, whereas for some guys it was the Chet Atkins world, which was sort of a different thing because that was country. But it's not like there was no crossover between those things or between those things and jazz. So as we come then into where I think you're trying to go is towards the more contemporary styles, there were all kinds of things going on. We also haven't mentioned all the people that I got to know only when I came to England the first time.
Yeah, exactly.
Again, with Stefan. So there you already had, as we knew, Bert Jansch, John Renbourn. We knew who Davey Graham was, even though we didn't really have his records in the United States at that time. So there was this whole way of playing. John James and Dave Evans were two other guys that I met early on. So I got to know all of these people and got to be friends with them. Davey was a person who had a very an amazingly direct approach to anything he wanted to do. He didn't see any reason, like, well, if I'm going to play a jazz tune, he would play it in E. He would play it in A. It didn't cross his mind that he should play it in E flat or B flat.
Yeah.
Not that there's anything striking about that. I had the same idea, but a lot of people that learn jazz, that would just be crazy. You would always play it in the original key. John and I got to be very close because, you know, he really looked into all these things, and we could communicate at length about all these things. Bert was not much of a communicator. He was much more of an instinctive musician. Davey, you could communicate with up to a point, and you could learn from. But John was a person who you could sit there and bat things around with and go in and out. So, you know, I said, look, John, this is dollar brand stuff. This sounds great on guitar. And, of course, he got into it himself and did a lot with it. Same with the Randy Weston records I gave him. And so it's hard to talk about, but there was an idea about what could be a guitar instrumental that included everything from Irish music through, or blues, or bluegrass, all the way through swing, ragtime, all the way to modern jazz. And then, of course, there was all kinds of ways to make new music, to make new tunes. Stefan, for instance, used to write in a way that, for lack of something else to call it, you could hear a lot of rock and roll influence. So that when I played with Stefan on stage, we would play these instrumentals, mostly that he wrote, and sometimes I would contribute parts. And, you know, it was hard driving. It was really pushing in a way that was like, you know, contemporary rock and roll, coming out of blues and with some jazz influence. Peter Finger also, his first record that wasn't like blues records, he called it, I think, acoustic rock. So that's another influence. The other thing I haven't mentioned, because it was not something that I got into, was the Fahey, the kind of tangent that he took, and Kotke, and that kind of school, which of course has a lot to do with where someone like Alex Degrassi comes out of. I mean, yeah, all these things come together, you know.
It sounds like John Fay on one side of the ocean and Davey Graham on the other side were probably at the same time doing something similar. Can it be?
I mean, it could be described that way, but there's a lot of very, very big differences. Like I say, they were both very strong-minded characters, but technically there's a lot of difference. When John came out of blues, he came out of it in his way as somebody who really knew it, backwards and forwards, and had a certain vision about blues, and also, you know, early country players like Sam McGee. He had a certain angle on a way to come out of that into you know, his own contemporary kind of thing, and the stuff that Leo and other early people in that school took off from. Davey Graham is very different. He of course he was into blues and stuff, but I think for a lot of the British guys, it sort of started for them with Big Bill Broonzy, who they saw, and things like that. They wouldn't have gone back like Fahey did and really looked into exactly what Charlie Patton was doing, for instance. But Davey was into all kinds of other things in a general way. Davey was trying to play well and doing a good job of playing some very hip jazz tunes. This is something John Fahey, anything that he would ever do like that would be looking at that in a way that had to do with who he was. Whereas Davey would be doing that. He also was doing stuff with Irish music and looking at things like how to arrange on the guitar to back up traditional singing, you know, which had an enormous influence on Renbourn and Pentangle and everything that came. The record he did with Shirley Collins, I'm mostly thinking of. And so this is a lot different from John Fahey.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
and there's another thing that I don't want to get into too much because it will sound contentious, and I don't mean it that way. But a lot of the people that decided they were going to base what they did on what Fahey had done, and finding a little riff and then repeating it 3 times, and then taking another riff and repeating it 3 times. Davey Graham, there's nothing in Davey Graham that's anything like that. The tunes that he wrote for the most part were like little jazzy tunes, like 40-ton Parachute.
I just lost the first part of the concept because the sound was gone. The three thing. Can you repeat this, please?
Well, I was talking about John, and
Yeah.
I do want to stress I'm not trying to. This is it's gonna sound like I'm being judgmental, and I don't mean it that way. But
No, absolutely, it's clear.
the way that the music proceeds is by these simple kind of repetitious blocks of
Okay.
I'll play this little pattern and then I'll repeat it several times, then I'll go to the next little thing. I mean, you could describe Philip Glass the same way in a certain way. So I'm not trying to say this is good or bad, but it's very different from anything Davey Graham would ever have done. I guess you could say Angie is sort of a repetitive tune at the beginning, but that's only at the beginning. It doesn't develop that way. And tunes like Last House Room, 40-Ton Parachute, these are very different things. They were both at the same time, and they both inspired a lot of people who came after them. So to that extent, they're very similar. Then again, you get people like where you can start to see a similarity. You can come out of the British thing, and you can be Dave Evans, and then you can come out of the Fahey kind of thing and be Alex DeGrassi and do those things, and you can really hear a similarity between those two players. So you can find a middle ground between those two. But I think Davey and John really are very different.
What's your idea about the role that I'm just using the word pop singers, but it's much more than that. A lot of songwriters took advantage of open tunings to write music and to bring that with acoustic guitar to a very wide audience. I'm thinking about Johnny Mitchell, several great musicians. How deep is that role to you? You were living that, you were seeing that as he was developing. How much of a role was it really in your idea? For the acoustic guitar, of course. No, not just for you. For the instrument, for the whole thing.
It's an odd question in a way. I think you'd be better asking someone who. I mean, I'm sure there are players who would say that they see that as being very near to what they did, or you look at people like Bruce Coburn and people like this and that and this and that. My own interests are different, and I was more tuned in, as it were, when it came to using tunings to play with songs, to what Davey Graham and John Renbourn and people like that had done with traditional material. And that is something I did get very focused on and have worked with a lot. The more contemporary singer-songwriters using tunings, I mean, I think it makes perfect sense for them to do that. But by the same token, you had singer-songwriters who were using the acoustic guitar to back themselves up before they added the tunings to it. You play like Loudon Wainwright, if you play like even Bob Dylan, you don't need, or James Taylor, you don't need to do more than that, or Paul Simon, to back your songs. So add the tunings to it. This seems to me just to be a very logical step in that evolution.
Yeah. if you think of, I don't know, I was talking to Tommy Emmanuel several years ago, and he told me that one of his main influences was James Taylor. And if you think of the way James Taylor played the acoustic guitar as a fingerstyle player in those days, which is a long time ago now, it's very interesting, because the acoustic guitar was developing, but as someone like you studied a lot to get there. But when you think of James Taylor, you think of a songwriter, and his guitar playing was very subtle for
Yeah.
for the time.
Yeah. I mean, James Taylor, it wasn't that early. I mean, it was the late '60s when James Taylor came along. He did what he did very well, but I mean, even by then, it like I say, you had Dylan and that whole generation. Even somebody like Dave Van Ronk didn't just play blues; he wrote songs himself, some of which are excellent, and had ways of. And all that stuff had been going on for a long time. All the sort of first generation of, the first younger generation of folkies who came up in what we now jokingly call the folk scare. That was the common thing, was to back yourself with a guitar. And, there were lots of kids in Richmond, Virginia in the mid-'60s who were backing themselves on guitar and trying to be singer-songwriters. They may not have been very good, but that's what they were trying to do. James Taylor was just very, very good at it.
Yeah, of course.
So but in other words, I don't see that as something new. I just see it as he was very intelligent about how he approached what he wanted. And there's as you say, there's some subtlety in there which is worth appreciating. It's interesting to me to hear Tommy say that.
Yeah, I was asking you because, from far away as a country and as a different generation, sometimes, we have a perspective which is not really what so clear about what happened. I know that there were very, very good guitar players before, but I was thinking for the general audience, which could be the role of a very famous player compared to a great player that probably in that moment was not so famous. I'm asking this because I think that Eric Clapton's Unplugged, that record, just became the record that sold, the live record that sold more copies ever. And that record is, even if it's very, it's a new record, right, in the 90s, but it was very important to bring acoustic guitar again back to people after, the 80s and the electric guitar and all the guitar eras and everything. So it's something you would not think of. It's not a seminal record. But it was very important just because he's Eric Clapton, and a lot of guys just became aware of what an acoustic guitar could do. It's just a curiosity.
I've heard people say this, and I have no reason to doubt that it's true. But from my perspective, I never saw that, and it's certainly not like I all of a sudden saw twice as many people at my gigs because Eric Clapton made my record. I do want to return to the point that I was trying to make about James Taylor, which was only to say the folkies in the early '60s who were big stars, at least as big as James Taylor was in the late '60s. Peter, Paul, and Mary, and people like this all did play fingerstyle guitar. He was a little bit more refined player than they were. But this idea of backing yourself on acoustic guitar was, that's what, when I started out, I say I was fascinated by acoustic guitar playing. The reason is because of people like Peter, Paul, and Mary and the Kingston Trio, very pop folk acts that were there. This sound of people backing themselves, yes, that was the first thing that caught my attention before I knew who Blind Blake was. It was when I then started going to coffee houses and watching other kids, and then all of a sudden I started hearing the older kids. I heard someone play uh, a cover of Dave Van Ronk's version of St. Louis Blues, for instance. And I thought, wow, that's really great. There was another kid in Richmond, Virginia, who played blues very well. So I gravitated to that once I heard it. But like you say, that was something that was not known very much to the general public. Dave Van Ronk was not a big name in those days and for most of his life. But Peter, Paul, and Mary and the Kingston Trio were enormous. And so that's why I'm saying James Taylor is a part of that. He's you know, it's not like nobody thought of playing acoustic guitar.
Yeah, absolutely. I just made the name of a player I really like, and I identify with acoustic guitar if I don't think of the great fingerstyle players. Of course, I was trying something in the middle.
Yeah, well, I just James Taylor is a person who did a very good job of that. He added some subtlety to it, and what I always say about people like him and about people like Paul Simon and all these people, well, not all of them, but certainly guys like that, Loudon Wainwright is another one, they don't need to play guitar any better than they do. What they do is perfect for what they're trying to do. They don't need anything. And if they do, they'll hire somebody else if they want something better.
Absolutely. Let's go back to what you did instead, and how you developed. You're always studying. You're always growing. You told me years ago in Nashville that you were studying hard how to improvise in a free jazz style while playing, which is something Guy Van Duzer does very well, like you do. And I think that the two main players that do that so well, from what I heard. How do you feel you developed as a musician in years? I mean, did you have different periods in which you grew for something, maybe in certain years, and maybe for other things in others?
That's an interesting question. I mean, now let me just clarify what you're saying. When you're saying that comparing and saying that Guy and I both would improvise jazz, well, but we're talking about swing jazz. We're not talking about more modern styles. Guy doesn't play more modern style. And you're right. I mean, I can remember, for instance, there's certain licks that I've worked out. Okay, well, and I've said, wow, that's a nice one. I wonder, I said, but surely this is an idea that's going to be pretty obvious to somebody. I'm going to see somebody else do exactly the same thing. Let's wait and see. And it was probably 15 years later, but I saw Guy Van Duzer do exactly the same thing. Because we're approaching a similar material. We're coming from somewhat similar backgrounds and so forth and so on. You know, we're both playing alternating bass and we're trying to play swing and play licks off of it. If you come up with something that works out of a basic, nearly basic position, you can be pretty sure that somebody else is going to be in a similar area. I would add, though, that Pat Donahue does that as well as anybody, playing swing and improvising while he does it. And I'd say Tim Sparks certainly deserves a mention in that regard, and there's other people too. But Guy Van Duzer and I do, that's a comparison that's worth making. But I also do like to try to play more modern things, and Guy isn't interested in that, so far as I know. However, to get to the question of like, was I developing one thing at a time and then that? Not at first, certainly. I was interested in all these different things, and I might try this and I might try that. When I moved to San Francisco in 1973, I joined a bluegrass band right away. I started hanging out with a guitar player named Tom Keats, and we worked out a big repertoire of swing duets on the guitar, excuse me. And as I say, started playing with some of the other musicians around there, especially older guys, you know, from the previous generation that were playing traditional jazz and swing. And sometimes they would hire the two of us to be in a band instead of a piano player when there wasn't a piano in the bar and they needed somebody to play backup. and the horn players would say, "Come on, keep the beat up," you know.
Yeah.
But it's good experience. So I was interested in swing. I was interested in bluegrass. At the same time, I was also writing a sort of local column about jazz for Coda magazine and getting into the clubs so that I could write about the concerts without having to pay. So I'd be going down and I might be playing swing one night and then going down to the Keystone Corner to see Cecil Taylor play the next night. I said my interests were all over the place. First traditional Irish musician I ever met was in San Francisco at that time. His name was Sean Terrell. He's still going. He's moved back to Ireland, of course. But all these things. So I was going to record stores and I say, "Oh, let's see about this Irish music. What do they have?" This was before there was a section for Celtic music. So you could just get Irish music. And even in San Francisco in 1973, was not a big record section. A couple of years later, yes. So I was interested in all those things. And then it's sort of like I maintained that all the way through, but it's almost like I got more into focusing on individual projects and just letting them really take over almost all my creative energy more when I was a little bit older, like when I worked on the Herbie Nichols project where I was trying to arrange this very challenging modern jazz and do that solo guitar. And it was like I was living, breathing Herbie Nichols for about a year and a half. There's times when I thought I was going to go crazy.
Yeah, you gave me that record years ago, and I wrote about that on the magazine. It was a pretty challenging one. I admire you for that.
The thing about that, and this is probably something that's good for younger musicians who might watch this to hear. I was taking on something that I felt very, very insecure about. I thought, this is a record that's being promoted by John Zorn. He's producing it. It's going to be out there. People in the jazz world are going to see this record. They're going to listen to it. They're going to think I'm an idiot. Am I just going to fall on my face with this? And so I was really pushing myself in a way that was a bit scary. I was no longer a youngster at that point. This was I was in my mid-40s. But it really opened doors, and it got a very, very good reception from the jazz world in general. I think the jazz guitar world has remained a little unsure what to make of me because it's a very different approach.
Yeah.
But I got respect even from people who can do certain things that I could never do. And as far as, modern jazz on the guitar.
Sure.
And so the message here is not to say don't be afraid. Is to say be afraid. Go someplace, push yourself someplace where you are scared. I think
get out of your comfort zone.
Yeah. Somebody comes along and says, "I want you to do this impossible thing." Try.
Push the boundaries. Yeah, of course. Yeah, you'll never discover if you don't push the boundaries. You wrote a lot of music and you arrange a lot of music. Is there something you prefer, and what's your approach to that?
Well, the first thing I'm going to say about this, when people talk about they want to compose for the instrument, the way you learn to compose is to learn to arrange. So, if you now you could say, all right, I'm going to play. I want to learn. Boy, listen to Chet Atkins. The way he plays St. Louis Blues is perfect. I'm going to learn that arrangement and I'll learn from that. And you will, but you'll actually learn more about guitar playing and maybe some about the way Chet thinks about the instrument, which is very much worth learning, than you will about arranging. You say the way you learn about arranging is to take another old tune and say, all right, let me try this one. Now, maybe not right away. Maybe you should learn 2 or 3 other Fat Swaller tunes before you try your own arrangement of one that you haven't heard anybody play on guitar.
Absolutely.
But that's how you learn to arrange, and in my experience, that helps you learn to compose more than anything, because then when you have an idea, you'll have an idea about what to do with that idea. I've been to a lot of guitar competitions that, again, I want to be careful here, where the idea was these are young players and we're supposed to sit there and judge them and say who's the most interesting. And if you travel around and do this for a little while, an awful lot of people will sound the same, because they'll be sort of imitating this idea or that idea, and they don't show that. For instance, you could take a Beatles song and you can arrange that song and make your own arrangement. That will teach you something. Obviously, I'm saying that learning George Gershwin tunes will teach you something. Learning a Thelonious Monk tune. Please learn some Duck Baker tunes. Learn, Davey Graham tunes. Learn everything you can. Learn some Irish tunes. But if you want to compose, learn to arrange. That's my advice. This is certainly, as I moved along things, like for instance, after I had, I was interested in writing sort of modern jazz or jazzy tunes from the mid 70s on, and you hear that on the Kicking Mule record I did, The Art of Fingerstyle Jazz Guitar. But it got more sophisticated as time went on, and certainly by the time I had arranged a lot of Thelonious Monk and the Herbie Nichols stuff, then I could see very much the influence of these musical thinkers in my own writing. And by now, I've written so many things there's no chance in the world that I'll ever be able to record them all. So if you want to volunteer to play some Duck Baker tunes, then let me know. Val Bonetti did some things with them that were great. And
do you always write on the instrument, or do you even write music down before playing?
As far as really writing the arrangements, it would be with the instrument. But especially before I started writing using the Maledetto Sibelius program on my computer, which has been driving me crazy lately. But when I'll be going into London, for instance, as I was saying to you before the interview, and this is something that, I'd have a half hour on the train, and then I'd have to go across London, in many cases, to go to a rehearsal or something. You take along a music notebook. I wrote a good few tunes, saying, oh, here's an idea. Where does this go? But there you're talking about tunes. So I might have an idea. Here's a little blues tune. And it might not turn into a guitar arrangement. It might just be something I would play, in my jazz trio with bass player and clarinet player to cover up my mistakes. But I might not. So it might just be that. It might just be a tune with chord changes. Heck, I even wrote one. Do you know the Bermuda Acoustic Trio guys?
Yeah.
Giorgio Butazzo.
Yeah, they're Italian like me. I know them.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if they're Italian like you. Maybe. I mean, you're from Rome, and Giorgio is Pugliese. So, if you eat turnip greens, maybe you're like him. Anyway, I went and we went and did some gigs down in the south of Italy. And while I was riding around in their truck, I wrote a tune and dedicated it to the mechanic that fixed his truck. But that's a whole other story. But if you have a little music pad, and you have enough facility with reading and writing music that just basic, you can write little tunes just like that. For me to write more than one part that way is unusual. Usually I'd have to have the guitar. I might, I could write the tune and have the idea for the chord changes, what they were. But.
And what do you do in case you have a melody, let's say something like this, and a few chords, but you just write it down. You try to stay in that key when you write the song with the guitar, or you just move it through keys just to find the right one for the guitar, I mean.
Oh, I see what you mean. I mean, a lot of times it depends on how involved the tune is and several other things. I might write a tune and I might be thinking it's in C, and then when I come home, I say, well, this is going to work better if I put it in A.
Yeah, this is what I was asking.
Again, though, that's the kind of choice I would go through when I would say, okay, I'm going to learn this Herbie Nichols tune, and I might have to try it in 2 or 3 or 4 keys before I find something that's even vaguely possible. Every now and then you say, oh, this works fine right where it was. You know, this is in C and these chord shapes are relatively normal. But that's very lucky.
Yeah. Especially bringing piano to guitar. That's luck.
Yeah,
usually.
And there's all kinds of things that you go through. Personally, in some ways, I'm a fairly avant-garde musician, and certainly compared to, say, a lot of people with folk music backgrounds, because American folkies usually don't even like jazz. But I'm very, very much a traditionalist in one sense, and that is I believe that with this whole game of arranging, composing, playing guitar, the instrument teaches you so much. That I don't believe in just that people have the idea that they don't need to learn an instrument. The instrument will really teach you, because you have to fight so hard to try to get certain effects and say, okay, how can I do this now? How can I do that now? There is a payoff for all those kinds of battles. And that's a very reactionary idea, but that's
yeah. So when you arrange a song, you try to go for the original key, or it just doesn't matter for you?
It depends on certain things. Like I certainly don't necessarily try to play jazz tunes in the keys they were written in. Jazz tunes tend to be in flat keys because they tend to be, they're usually played on horns, and those are flat key instruments and flat key. Now, if you're playing traditional tunes, they're usually played in sharp keys because they're played on the fiddle more than any other single instrument, and so they're going to be played on the same tunes as would be friendly for guitar. And it's very likely that if you go through and you're reading tunes out of O'Neill's, that all you have to do is play it an octave lower than where the fiddle would be playing it. And you're likely to be able to play an A minor tune in A minor and make the arrangement that way. You may want to go to drop D or some other tuning. People like to play a dead get on that stuff. It's been done hundreds of times, so obviously it works. But so that in that music, you're less likely to have to look for different keys. You're certainly not going to have to look all over the place like you might have to do with something like Thelonious Monk or Herbie Nichols. Having said that, I play a Monk tune like Off Minor, which is a very weird tune in terms of the chord progression, and I play it in G minor, which is his key. Because that's the other thing, of course. Once you get used to playing fairly advanced arrangements and so on, you find that these unusual keys will offer you all kinds of unexpected things in terms of like open string voicings. And you do see where modern jazz guitar players use that a lot. People like Gene Bertoncini and people coming out of that kind of school. That they make very, very good use of that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to a student the other day. I was showing him an E flat song, and I told you just can go back to the E flat just with the tritone through the E, and with the E you have the open sixth string, which is you wouldn't expect that in E flat, but that comes right in the right place.
Yeah. Wow, you could even like there's times when Thelonious Monk likes this trick a lot. If you're playing in C, say, he will end the chord he ends on will not be a C, but will be a D flat major seventh. So the C is in the top of the chord. So you could conceivably do that with your E flat, and then with and put the E over it. You could make it an E major seventh and end on that with the E flat as a D sharp. And,
this is a good one. I'm sure you have more.
Well, and what's interesting about this, and this is the kind of thing I used to talk with John Renborn about. We were talking about that great tune of Bert Jansch, which is known as Veronica. Bert told me, he said, "Oh, that's the record company. They messed that up. That one is supposed to be called Casbah, and the tune that's called Casbah on the record is supposed to be Veronica." So Casbah, as we know it, which is Veronica, is a thing where it's good. It's played in E minor with that little bass thing. Ba, 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 ba. So it's going from B and then C, but the melody has a C sharp in it. And as John says, he said that was just a mistake. He said, but he listened to it and it sounded good, and he kept it in there. We all do that. If this is the kind of, and this is an interesting point too, and it's going to sound contradictory to some of the things I was saying. I've met a lot of guitar players who, when they were real young guys, like even 20 younger than that, and they'd be making up their own stuff that would just be weird, and it wouldn't sound like anything else. And then you see them 3 years later, and they've learned how to play right, but it's much less interesting. Because the originality is no longer so evident. And it would be great if there was a way to keep that originality and also learn without driving it out of your head.
Yeah, the studying is so dangerous for creativity.
It can be, yeah.
It can be. It can be. Oh, this could go on forever. I mean, you have done so many great things. This could go on forever. But I don't want to take the whole day. I don't want to take advantage of your time.
Yeah, I mean, now just to come up to date on Duck Baker, not just because of the pandemic, but because of various, sort of nagging health issues. I don't get around so much anymore. I'm more focused on trying to release old recordings that I have that have not been released, and also still on composition. And this does mean that there are some other people that are going to be recording my tunes. The guitar can be seen in an awful lot of ways, but I think for a lot of us, the guitar, we remember what Paganini called it his little orchestra. You can get with guitar music, you can easily be showing three parts, the melody, the bass, and then some kind of middle voicings, at least often enough to give an impression of three-part harmony. This is a very full sound. With this, you get something that sounds fairly complete. If you have less than that, like a ukulele, it's a great little instrument, but it doesn't sound like a little orchestra. It sounds like a little guitar.
Yeah, sure.
And so this is something that you always come back to. There's still so much, no matter which direction you want to go with guitar music, fingerstyle guitar.
It's amazing.
Yeah,
it's more than a century, and for modern acoustic guitar, and it's still developing. And in recent years, it had a huge impact on younger generations, and a lot of players have been doing great things, and very different from what has been done in the past.
Yeah, no, the possibilities are endless. I do encourage people not to just get too caught up in what other guitar players are doing, but in the music that we listen to and interpreted and so on. I mean, certainly, say if you want to play Irish music, don't just listen to Duck Baker and John Renborn and Dave Evans and Pierre Bensizon. Even though a lot of these people have done very good things, Pierre, when he plays Irish music, it sounds fantastic. But don't stop there. Franco Maroni is another one who you know, lots of people play Irish music. Well, we can't forget Tony McManus, who in a certain way does it better than all of us. But Tony is a Scottish musician who's playing this music, playing his music and using it on the guitar. He is coming straight out of that tradition. And if we want to play that music, then, you know, go back and listen to the people who play it on the original instruments. And,
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Duck, I think this is it. I want to thank you so much. It's been great to see you again because we haven't met in a while now. So it's been, first of all, great to see you.
Was Nashville the last time I saw you?
I think so. And I hope you'll be back in Italy, or that I'll be back in England, whatever. Yeah. Or we're both back in the US. Who knows? Whatever. Any place is good when you meet someone.
Yeah. Anyway, you know, I'll let you know if I'm in Italy. It's funny because I played in Rome so infrequently. I mean, really, since Folk Studio closed, I've only played there a couple of times, and nothing really memorable. You know, when I go to Italy, it's almost all north of there.
Yeah, imagine that.
But I'll let you know.
I will stop the recording now, and we can say goodbye in private. Thank you so much, Duck Baker, for doing this. This has been, you made my day, and this has been great. Thank you for contributing to the project, and I will see you, everyone, on another occasion. Goodbye. Thank you, Duck Baker. Goodbye. Okay. This was the Acoustic Guitar Show.
Okay. Grazie, ciao.